All right, well, I want to welcome everybody back. This is our fifth installment of the Teaching Our Kids Empathy series. We're really excited about this, and the fact that we're halfway through, again, speaks to that old, true but trite phrase that time really flies by, right? When you're having a great time, hopefully. So, as a reminder, again, that we are using a lot of the material from the book Unselfie by Michelle Borba. So if you don't have it, definitely it's worth checking out or giving it to family and friends. And I wanted to talk about this is a great topic today. And I think that sometimes it can just be something that you say, oh, we talk about kindness. Like, what is there to say about kindness? But actually, the reality is there's a lot to say about kindness. And it's funny, as Jamie and I get ready to come on this morning or this afternoon, we have what we call Motivation of the Month. And that is something that every month, one of our colleagues takes basically kind of has a quote that they put out there on email with a little explanation of why they were moved by the particular quote itself and why it's important. And so Macy Eggeman is our talented referral specialist and educational coordinator, and she had no idea that today was about kindness. But her quote of the month this morning was, quote, "How do we change the world? Question mark. And the answer is one random act of kindness at a time," which is a quote by Morgan Freeman. And as good as that quote was, I want to read the commentary that Macy put forth. She said, we've had a lot of talk lately about the overwhelming need for mental health providers in this area, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. Waitlists continue to grow and the demand is ever increasing. And while kindness doesn't replace evidence-based psychological care, I'm reminded that kindness goes a long way. We can do a lot of good work here at Easterseals and other places in town, but we can't help everyone. However, we can focus on being kind in all of our daily interactions with clients, coworkers, family, friends, and strangers we encounter in public. We never know what others are going through. Being unapologetically kind can make a bigger difference than we realize. Well said, Macy. Well said. So with that, we're going to kick off this idea of, again, the idea of kindness, the practice of kindness. I'm going to pass it over to Jamie, my colleague, to kind of initiate that. So thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, so it's definitely gives us something to think about. I reflected on Macy's message and kind of thinking in my own head, like how I feel when someone is kind. It almost is shocking sometimes when you're like, wow, you're a stranger and you didn't owe me anything. But I do think we owe each other this, right? Like, I do think that it's a really overlooked part of our society, and it's something that we can easily model and teach our kids. And it's a key building block because when we think about this idea of empathy and then this thought of kindness, I think we talked earlier in this series, Jim, about that it's not the same thing as charity, but it's kind of beyond that. In we're not doing it because we feel sorry for someone. We're not doing it for any kind of gain or outcome for ourselves. But this idea that when we're kind to people and they respond kindly back to us, it kind of internally reinforces the behavior in that we feel good about ourselves. And I don't know if you want to start
I
off
was
with a
thinking about that,
comment,
and
but
I was thinking about as a parent. I think oftentimes when we were growing up as kids, and I'm sure I'm speaking to everyone else here, you kind of looked at your parents as, well, this is just they have to do things for us, and this is just part of their role, and to some extent, that's not wrong. But as you got older and we become parents ourselves, we start to realize that let's be honest, there are still lots of things that we do, not just because it's our role and our obligation, and even because we love our kids, but because we also appreciate certain things that they do. And I think that as Jamie's going to get into more, one of the first things we really need to encourage our kids to understand is that we are, again, human beings, and everybody else around them is human beings, their teachers, their parents. And the kinder you are, the more it really just works so much better, both in regards to what you're able to get, both in regards to just how enjoyable the situation is. Kindness really kind of makes the world go round. And I think of my own kids. I mean, sometimes the fact that you want to give them a big hug when they do something really nice is a great way to start where we go from here.
yeah, as you're talking, Jim, I'm thinking a lot about my own personal experiences. And one thing that I know for myself, I can be transparent, and I don't have kids, but I work with them every day, and I can think about my own life, even as an adult. And some of the things we've talked about over the past few weeks We talked about self-regulation being really difficult when you don't have emotion regulation or a clear moral identity. And honestly, kindness sounds so simple, but it can be really hard to be kind when you aren't regulated. So I think about my own journey in being a more regulated person and not, my emotions drive a lot of what I do. And I think in some ways that can be a good thing, but in some ways it's really hard to be regulated, to make a decision that is in line with my values. And I think the same thing goes with kindness. Like if I'm having a bad day, I don't want to be nice. I want to be grumpy. And maybe it's I'm not actively being mean, but I'm kind of just like, I'm not going to hold the door. I'm not going to wait the extra second to, say thank you for my latte at Starbucks. I'm just going to get it and walk out. But those things matter. And I think you can tell very quickly when you do respond in a kind way, how people really react. And we'll get more into it, but I kind of just wanted to share that I'm thinking like this piece of really being in tune with your own emotions can help you realize that even when you're not actively trying to be hurtful or mean, your behavior may not always be kind. And it's really hard to get back in that kind of habit of building kindness as a way of life, a way of living.
And I think along a similar vein, but even in a positive way, one of the things that we really want to teach our kids about this idea of kindness is that it's not dependent or predicated on their emotion. Meaning, you might be feeling like you're having a bad day, and it's natural for us to kind of like react and displace our emotions. But we really want to teach even our young kids to say, even if you're having a rough day, or even if you're frustrated, look, you can have that emotion, and that can be really real. But you still have a choice. You still have this ability, right? This willful ability to say, I'm feeling kind of rough, but that would be a really nice thing to do. And so I think when we start to teach our kids early on that their emotions don't necessarily drive their behaviors, we're actually, and again, Jamie and I would talk about this, we're really employing the prefrontal cortex to say, this is how I'm feeling, but think about what you can do here to do the right thing. And so kids who are not taught that actually become oftentimes adults who just kind of like assume that their emotions are the driver, right? Kids who
Mhm.
are taught that recognize that I can feel one thing and be authentic, but it's not necessarily the driver of how I treat other people. And that is a game changer with relationships. I mean, it's just a huge game changer when they go on to their adult relationships or even kid relationships and how satisfying and good those are.
Yeah, I think that idea of you're being the driver of your feelings instead of your feelings driving you. And we see so many kids and adults in our office who can't do that. And it is much harder for them to not only be kind, but even to accept kindness from others. Um, Dr. Borba starts this chapter with a really cool story about this idea that kindness is contagious, and that even just with small acts of kindness perpetrated sounds negative, done or enacted maybe by just a few small individuals can really have a kind of waterfall effect on other people. She talks about this school and this revolution kind of that they had regarding random acts of kindness, but it doesn't need to be that broad. We don't need to start a kindness revolution, where we try to get everybody in our neighborhood, but even like the quote that Jim started with, just one at a time. Because the research shows over and over again that when someone treats you kindly, you are more likely to be kind either in return or in the future. And so it kind of creates this feeling. And again, I think it's something to do with the social aspect of being human. We work together better, or we're better together. So if someone is kind to you, biologically, maybe even we're trained to get reinforcement from that feeling. I can again think back to Starbucks. It's always on my mind. I'm always on my coffee. But when I order online and I walk into Starbucks, and even though the baristas are doing their thing and they're cleaning and doing whatever, and they're not even paying attention to me, but I go to pick up my drink that's already been made, I had zero interaction with these people. They don't know me. I could walk out and never talk to them. It wouldn't matter. But I always try to say thank you because I feel like you did something for me. I get nothing in return. I got my drink. It didn't matter whether I said thank you or not for me, but it matters to them. And almost every single time, not only do they say you're welcome, they say have a great day, enjoy your drink. And I feel better. I just do. So
And
when we start, yeah,
I
go
want to
ahead.
add that real quick because it's a great example. And so here's what we know from the science behind what Jamie's describing is that kindness leads to obviously a lot of the good things we're already saying, but kindness leads to an increased likelihood of gratitude. increased likelihood of being thankful, right? Well, we know that gratitude leads to increased likelihood of many, many positive things: increased positive mood, decreased anxiety, improved social connections. So, what we're saying here is that scientifically speaking, that kindness is really the gatekeeper to greater gratitude, and gratitude itself unlocks a lot of really restorative and positive mental health effects. And so that's exactly what you're feeling in like Starbucks and other places is you're literally, I mean, again, it's like a therapeutic agent. You're giving out in a positive way, but what we often don't realize is we probably gain more in return than that person that we're giving to, right? And so I think that's a really neat way to think about this with kids. And I would encourage all of you parents listening, literally like explain that, draw it out, put it on paper. So kindness equals more gratitude, thankfulness, which equals more positive mood, less anxiety, lots of other things. And it's interesting. There's a word over the years when I've had, kids in session who, let's say, are at least 8 or older, who've kind of got a decent vocabulary. And I've used this word. The word is reciprocity, and it's a big word, but it's a fun word. So I actually like to use it a lot. So I'm like, all right, word of the day. And so here's a new one for the parents listening: reciprocity. What's reciprocity? They're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. That is whatever. And I basically say reciprocity is basically getting what you give, right? You get what you give out, right? Now, again, I know that's not a perfect one-to-one. It's not always like that. But the idea as we teach kids around this is that the more likely you give out positivity and kindness, the more likely you're going to get it back. But the more you don't give it out and you give other things, the more likely you're going to get those things back. So it's kind of a fun word to say, reciprocity, but it's got a big message behind it.
And so I think when we set kindness as the standard and we expect that from our kids and from ourselves, then we can easily kind of set forward this really awesome and cool chain of events that leads to so many greater outcomes. And kindness is just one small piece of that, but it's really important because, again, not only can it change how we feel about others, but it can also change how we feel about ourselves. So there's this concept in psychology that we try to align our behaviors subconsciously, not intentionally, with how we see ourselves. So if I see myself as depressed, I'm more likely to do depressed things like sleep more, eat less, not want to go on a walk, things like that. And the same thing holds true for kindness. If we are showing our kids and helping them engage in kind behaviors, they're more likely to see themselves as kind. And then again, they're more likely to do kind behaviors. So when we can really have this idea that our behavior matches our image and we behave kindly, we will see ourselves as kind. And kindness opens the door for kids to really engage in empathy because they're not doing it because they have to. They're not doing it because they feel sorry for someone. They're doing it because of who they are as a person, that moral identity piece. And they can go forward in the world with this view of, I'm doing for others because it's the right thing to do, because I feel good after. And I can really meet them where they're at. I can see, you know what, Starbucks is busy today. My latte isn't done yet. No big deal.
Yeah.
I'm not going to yell at them and ask them where my coffee is, right? We see this sometimes. We can see the adult who's not engaging in that empathy when they're like up in the front, like, where's my drink? I've been waiting for 10 minutes. We see those people and we don't want to be like those people. We want to identify as the kind, compassionate, empathetic coffee drinker, if you will,
Yeah,
for the day. That's my
no, I love the analogy, and I was thinking about like as we're kind of like helping our kids grow up and understand how to interact with others. Another great example is the question: if they call, let's say they have something wrong with their bill, like their phone bill or whatever else like that, and they call to kind of investigate and deal with that, right? The question is for our kids: when you get on the line with that individual who has nothing to do with probably what's wrong, they just happen to be who's answering the phone. The question is, how do we treat those people, right? Because I think the tendency again is if you're frustrated, we said this earlier, is just our kids think, well, if I'm frustrated, they deserve my frustration. But actually, the whole idea of empathy is you thinking, well, wait a second, but they're not even responsible for my frustration. They just happen to be the representative on the phone for that company, right? But unless you really start with this idea of kindness right off the bat, I think it can be hard for kids and adults to really think about that, right? Because it's like, well, I'm just going to unload my frustration and that's what I'm feeling. but wait a second, that's not honoring the kindness that leads to greater empathy. And so there's a lot of different ways. And I think that, obviously as parents, we're not going to be perfect. We're going to make mistakes on this one like everything else, but we want to consider how we model this. And I remember, being in the hall years ago, fortunately not here at Easterseals, but another place that I worked. And I listened to one of my colleagues, just really going off on someone through IT because their computer wasn't working or whatever. And I thought to myself, this is supposed to be, a helping professional. And this individual is just unloading on someone who has not done anything to make this computer not work, right? There was a missing link there. Number one, that person did not start with kindness. But number two, clearly there was not empathy to understand, and empathy is always corresponding. Jamie, I think it's important for us to say this. Empathy corresponds with reality. Empathy is not a false, like God, it's not a false, thing that exists. It's basically saying, I'm trying to understand what's real as much as I'm trying to understand what's good. And that's kind of important for us to remember.
Yeah, and your thought made me think of something else too, which is even if the IT person had come in and smashed the computer with a hammer, right? We can still engage in this idea of, yeah, I'm pretty upset because why would you do that? Like we're thinking about siblings. I can think probably this may or may not happen in your house with 8 kids that Will and Noah or Will and Lewis are fighting, right? And Will really does do something to bother one of his siblings or whatever the situation may be. And yes, they have every right to be angry and upset with him, but it doesn't give us the right to be mean or not show kindness. And I think that goes with that one, emotion regulation, and two, that self-regulation, that idea of saying, if I can't say something kind, or if I'm going to do something that is driven by emotion and not by my underlying moral code, then maybe I don't need to do anything at all. And helping kids realize that too. You get the charge on your cell phone bill and you realize, oh my gosh, one of the kids, had extra data, whatever the charge is. You're really angry and upset. Maybe you don't call the cell phone company right away. Maybe you wait a few days until you've calmed down, and you can talk through that with your kids too. And just like with everything else we've talked about in this series, the idea of strengthening kindness is really by talking and modeling it with our kids. Because again, we can't expect them to be perfect. We're not perfect either. But every opportunity you have to model this and explain, you know, I was upset earlier. I didn't call the cell phone company, or I could tell you were angry and that's why you said a mean word or called your brother a mean name. Let's practice again with a kind choice instead. Or what's an opportunity for you to show kindness to your brother, even when he stole your toy or, got something on your picture that you made at school. That's the really big key here, is always just promoting that is the better path. There's always going to be multiple choices. We're not always going to make the best one, but what's the best path that'll make us feel good for no other reason than we know it's the right thing to do?
And logically speaking, too, what happens is if someone doesn't at least react in a kind way or at least a neutral way, the other thing that, I mean, just when you have kids at home, is that it's almost like a pinball effect. So there's negative actions followed by negative reaction, followed by negative reaction, and boom, 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 back and forth. And I think a lot of families feel this, is that they never really feel like they get outside of those negative, pinball reactions. Well, how do you stop that? Well, at some point, someone has to say, and I know this sounds cliche, but someone has to kind of take a higher route and either just say, I got to take a break and we're kind of done. Or someone has to say, I'm actually going to take the initiative to try to be kind, even though I didn't like what you did. I'm going to do something that kind of, basically levels the playing field back to a better place. And so there's a logical sequence in families that if we don't practice this and teach this, I think some of you have grown up in environments, or maybe in environments now, where you always felt like there was tension in the household. And really, let's be honest, the tension isn't just regarding conflict that happens over specific events, but it's also regarding that people never step outside the emotion that they have and never realize, like, just because I'm feeling this doesn't mean I have to create an environment that's very unfavorable or difficult to be around. And so it's very much it's a willful thing, but from the neurological standpoint, we have to teach that idea of a willful thing from an early age to be most effective, honestly.
And to also remember, like, if there is this kind of reinforced negative to negative to negative to negative behavior, that's not going to change overnight. That's a learned pattern of not only of learned behaviors, but also of your brain's responses to someone else's behavior. Just like with anxiety or depression or any of the other things that we treat here in our office, we're not going to change your anxious thoughts every time you leave the house, just one session you leave the house. So being patient and kind of cultivating this idea that it's small interruptions in those patterns over time if you're noticing that that seems to be a barrier or an issue in your family. And as Jim was saying, there's so many benefits to this that it's hard to, sometimes you're like, this can't be real. Like, how can this just small action decrease selfishness, increase happiness? And honestly, the research even shows that kids become more popular among their peers. Peers want to be around the kids who are kind. I don't think that is shocking news, but it kind of just is more humbling in that when you think about it, it's like, okay, this literally could help my kid in every single environment across their whole life and set them up for success just by making a few really key changes to how we as a family talk about these things.
And the other thing,
Kindness.
Jamie, it's
Yeah, go
interesting, I
ahead.
was going to say about that is that not only do peers like to be around other kids who are kind, but other parents like their kids to be around other kids who are kind. Does that make sense? So it's like, think
Yes.
about this from a social conduit standpoint. Like your child is more likely to get friends reinforced by other parents if they're seen as someone who's kind and considerate and empathetic than if they're not. And so little do you know that behind the scenes, your child's acts of kindness might be creating friendships because other parents are like, hey, so and so, he's such a nice guy. Like, why don't we set something up or why don't we do this? Right. And so we just, it's back to the Macy's quote at the very beginning. We don't really understand, and it's often mysterious how these acts and this, I like you said, this attitude of kindness, this character of kindness really kind of pays it forward, but it really does. And it's really cool to see it happen and to see kind of how environments can change for the better if even just one person takes that. And I encourage everybody today to think about this, that no matter what setting you're in, no matter how your household is, no matter how much you feel powerless to change lots of things, even though nothing changes automatically, just someone saying, you know what, for the next week, I'm going to really make an intentional gift and opportunity to be kind in ways I might not have been kind before. And slowly or not slowly, you can start to see things shift just with one initiative like that.
Yeah. And I think too, going back to what we've said before about this, our cultural shift that we're trying to have here, where we're saying, yes, it's important for our kids to go, 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 academic success, all of these things our culture tells us, our society says is so important. But at the end of the day, kindness is easy, it's free, and it really can just be a huge way to change your perspective and your own feelings about yourself. Um,
So, Jamie, I wanted to make sure as we're getting lower on time, you
yeah,
had some really great ideas here about how we can increase kindness in our kids. I think we talked actually a lot of different ways
right.
around that, but you had a couple of things around even like the two kind rule, which I thought would be neat for you to explain,
Yes.
and a couple other things. So,
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I appreciate you getting me back on track. I was kind of lost in my notes for a second. So this idea is really cool, and it's actually something as I was rereading the chapter that I was like, I think when I first read this, I wanted to do it, and I never did. And it's so easy. So the two kind rule, it's not really a rule, but she calls it that in her book. But essentially, you are committing to do 2 acts of kindness a day. As Macy's quote says, random act of kindness, it doesn't really matter how you as and your family define what a kind act is, except for that you do it together as a family. There's so many free, easy, simple 5-minute or less ways to be kind, not only in your home, but in your community, in your school, in your workplace, all of these things. Emptying the trash in your bathroom, the kids can do that. Or asking brother, do you need, water before we sit down for dinner? Any little act of kindness that's appropriate for your family, developmentally appropriate for your kids, can be a part of this rule. And there's 3 kind of parameters of this rule. The first one is The act has to be straight from the giver's heart. So it's not something that I'm doing because I want something in return, but it's because I am feeling like it's something that I can give to you to be kind. It has to be delivered face to face. So it doesn't count if you are texting a friend and saying, "Hey, I liked your shirt today," or anything like that. I know sometimes you're sick or you're ill. Be kind and gracious to yourself as well, but knowing that an act of kindness doesn't happen from behind a computer screen or a cell phone. And then the biggest key is that we do it without expecting something in return. And that includes how we talk about this with our kids. So when we set up the two kind rule at home, we're not doing this at the end for $5 extra allowance or for who can do the most kindness gets an extra prize. Instead, it's we're doing this because it's part of our family's moral identity and what's important in this in this world, in our lives. Um, Making it a habit, it's basically doing it over and over again. Do what you say you're going to do to your kid with your kids. Dr. Borba talks about this idea of how would your kids describe your biggest key message of what you wanted for their life when they were young. Did they say it was for them to be kind, or would they say it was for them to be successful or go to college? What are the things that you are emphasizing and talking about with your kids that leaves the biggest impact on them? This idea of friends and friends' parents. Even if your kid says they're friends with someone, if their parents are not kind, that's not a good choice of friend for your kid. And I think that when you have this ability from what you can to encourage your children to seek out kindness in others and associate with others who are kind, then they are again seeing that reinforcement and that back and forth of the more kind I am, the more kindness comes back to me. Yeah, so the main thing though is set this goal, and not even really a goal, more of an expectation for behavior for your whole family. And then just like with everything else we've talked about, how are you talking about this with your kids? Are you reinforcing their behavior for what they did or why they did it? Oh, you complimented your brother and that was kind, versus you complimented your brother, I'm going to give you $5, whatever that thing is. That it's more about helping them incorporate kindness into their identity rather than as another thing to check off the to-do list.
Here at Easterseals, as an example of this, we have what we call the high five. And the high five is basically when, any of us exhibit, let's say, teamwork or excellence or stewardship, kind of core values. And so the high five is something you can fill out online or you give to them directly that basically shows that you recognize that act that went above and beyond what they necessarily need to do. And actually, Jimmy, as you were saying this, and as we're kind of getting closer to wrapping up, I was thinking another way is just simply like back in the beginning, if you sense there is an act of kindness that anybody in the house is giving, whether it's a fist pump or a high five or it's a hug, I mean, something very simple from a social world goes a long way in saying, hey, that was a great, not only a great act, but it brings us more together. It connects us better. And we talked last week about celebrating all these different components of empathy. I mean, we're really kind of celebrating this act of kindness, right? This culture of kindness and this character of kindness that we're really trying to promote there. So I think it's just kind of
Right.
different ways each family can do it.
And I think that's the biggest thing that I want to emphasize throughout this series is that it's not just on you as a parent or on your child as the child, but this focus on how can you together cultivate this as a family, whatever your family looks like, is really a way that it can start small and build so much bigger in how you are just talking and interacting with your kids in those little moments that we do have.
So I'm gonna end my section here with a real quick story. This I think kind of sends us home. Years ago, I was trained by a psychiatrist, Dr. Peters, and he was one of our faculty in Louisville. And he told me the story about he had seen this young man, and it had been like 10 or 15 years since he had seen him, and he ran into him kind of in somewhere in the public space or whatever. And they recognized each other, and the guy said, "Hey, I just wanted you to know that I really, really appreciated so much of what you meant to me when you worked with me years ago." And he said, I'll be honest, I don't remember exactly a lot of what you said to me or a lot of exactly what you told me I should do, but I remember just how kind you were and how really, really caring I felt like you were to me. And that literally itself has stayed with me in such a positive way for all these years. And I always just love that story. It's not to say that we don't want to seek out the best of what we do and all the technical skills and everything else, but all the way back to Macy's quote at the beginning, you know what? It doesn't replace, we say psychological care. It doesn't replace parenting in a, strategic, intelligent way. Like none of this replaces it. But there is a great inherent value in what we've described today in the acts of kindness that supersedes our ability to understand. But literally, just like that young man described to Dr. Peters, literally can live on decades from when that occurs. So, if anything, that's what we're talking about today, that sense of authenticity, a sense of kindness, which gives way to gratitude, which gives way to empathy, and certainly a much broader and beautiful picture.
Yes, I'm left with that Maya Angelou quote. I believe it was her. People will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they won't forget how you made them feel. So, in that vein, please enjoy the rest of your November week or first week of November. I hope everybody had a safe Halloween. If you did anything, I was at home studying, so I did not do anything fun for Halloween. But thank you guys so much, and we will see you next week.
Thanks a lot.